Hello and welcome to Knit Designs. First of all, I would like to say huge thanks to all of you who've subscribed to my channel, liked my videos and left comments. Thank you so much for your support. In this video, I would like to follow up on my faster knitting technique video, which has received the most views so far and has attracted a lot of interest. The technique shown in the video was how I figured out to knit when I was younger, and I wasn't even aware that there was a name for it. So since posting the video, I've learned that there is a name for the technique, as called combination knitting method. Some of the viewers call the technique as Eastern European or Russian method, as apparently this technique is very popular in that region. In the video I also called that knitting method as Continental due to the way I held my yarn. Whether that technique can be called a type of continental knitting or not is, I guess, is a matter of opinion. I think it doesn't really matter how you knit. You are, as long as you're having fun in the process and are happy with your outcome, that is really what matters. Many of you were, in fact, familiar with this technique, yet others wanted to find out more or were confused about the method. The key advantage of the combination method, in my opinion, is the simplified way of knitting purl stitches. Now, purl stitches are not my favorite stitches to knit. If I can knit them using combination method, then that's the method I'm going to go for. The combination method is not without a disadvantage, of course, as many of you have pointed out, that the stitches are positioned differently to the way you would expect them to be positioned in the traditional knitting. And that is correct. The stitches are kind of positioned differently, and therefore if we need to make decreases or knit in lace or follow a pattern, then the pattern will assume that you're knitting in the way that the continental knitting would form stitches. So if you need to make decreases or you need to knit lace, then you need to reposition the stitches in order to do that. Of course, if you're following a complex pattern such as complex lace knitting, for example, then it may not be practical to continuously reposition stitches. So in that case, I would opt for the traditional continental knitting method. Therefore, today I would like to follow up on my original video, walk through the combination knitting method, yet again compare it to the continental knitting, and show how to approach left and right decreases. To demonstrate and to compare the two types of knitting, the combination and the traditional continental knitting methods, I'm going to use different coloured yarn. So for the continental knitting, I'm going to use red yarn, and for the combination knitting, I'm using blue yarn. The way I see both methods is that purl stitches pretty much determine how the knit stitches are positioned. Because of that, I'm going to begin knitting my first row on the wrong side by forming purl stitches. To cast on the stitches, I've used the long tail cast on method, traditional continental knitting. I'm just going to knit the first stitch, it's easier, and then the next stitch is going to be purl stitch. So in the continental knitting, we hold our working yarn in the left hand, and to form purl stitches, we simply twist the yarn over the right needle and then pull the yarn through. I'm obviously exaggerating the movements so that it's clear what the process is for this knitting. So simply insert the needle into the first stitch, wrap the yarn over the needle and then pull it through. So the key point about the continental knitting is that we wrap the yarn and we use our index finger to help us form purl stitches here. On the right side we've got our knit stitches, and we have a look how they're positioned. So there are two kind of references to a stitch. So the stitch has either front loop and back loop, or left and right. So if we kind of just slip the first stitch off, kind of reverse it out so it faces us, so it's got the right side and left side. So the right side in the Continental knitting is positioned so that it faces us, and the left side is kind of sits behind the needle, kind of is the side that we do not see, is the side that is on the reverse, kind of on the wrong side. And then of course when we carry on knitting stockinette stitch, we pick this front side of the stitch, or the right side of the stitch, and knit through it. So insert the needle from front to back and knit stitches this way. Onto my blue yarn, and this is my combination knitting. So when I begin knitting, all my stitches on both needles are positioned exactly the same, because when we cast on, the stitches are positioned exactly the same. So the first row on the wrong side will determine how the stitches are positioned on the right side. So here I'm going to do exactly the same. Knit the first stitch. The second stitch I'm going to purl, and I'm going to purl using the combination method. So in the combination method, again, our yarn is in position in front of our left needle, and then we insert the right needle into the stitch, and then simply turn the needle and pull the yarn through the stitch, and this forms our purl stitch. So the difference, see the difference in movement here. So the movement in the Continental knitting was kind of, we wrapped the yarn over the needle and then pulled the yarn through. In combination method, kind of like go over the yarn with a right needle and pull it through the stitch. And what makes this method of knitting better and faster than the Continental method is the effort that we save on the additional movements that we have to make to form purl stitches. So instead of kind of moving the yarn and left hand and our index finger in order to form the stitch, we simply glide our needle over the yarn and then pull the yarn through the stitch. So we've got fewer movements here than in the traditional Continental knitting. Let's analyze our stitches on the right side. So on the right side I've got knit stitches, and the way they're positioned is, if I kind of pull the first one off the needle, is that the right side, instead of being at the front of the needle like in the Continental knitting, it now sits at the back of the needle, or at the back of the needle, and the stitch looks more opened out than in the Continental knitting. So here our stitches kind of enclosed. When we look at our knitting from here, all we see here is the right side of the stitch. And if you look at a stitch here, we see kind of more of a stitch with the right side being kind of more at the back of the needle, and at the front is a left side of the stitch. So when we knit our knit stitches, we do not pick a stitch from this side because we're picking the left, and we would end up, just knit the first one, so we do not pick this side of the stitch because we would end up with a crossed stitch like that. What we need to do in the combination knitting is kind of insert from front to back. Almost at the moment looks like knitting through the back loop, but it's not the back loop. Well, it's kind of back loop, but it's not the same back loop as in the Continental knitting, because this is effectively front of a stitch. The kind of the front of a stitch is at the back, so we just insert the needle into the stitch from this side, and knit and pull the yarn through. So the hand movement for forming the knit stitches is exactly the same in the combination method. It's just we're picking the stitch from a different direction. However, effectively we pick the same part of the stitch here. It's just the stitch is positioned differently. So we pick exactly the same part of the stitch. It's just in the Continental knitting, the stitch is positioned this way, so the right side of the stitch faces us at the front, and we insert the needle this way. In the combination knitting, the stitch is reversed out so that the right side is kind of positioned behind the needle. So we insert the needle this way to pick up the right side of the stitch. So I'm just going to work a couple more centimeters in both methods in order to show what the two methods look like compared side by side, and do we get a different knitting effect knitting one or the other. Now here I worked a few more rows in the combination style. This is the right side, and this is the wrong side with purl stitches, and here is my knitting in the Continental knitting style, and here are my knit stitches on the right side, and here my purl stitch on the purl side. So if we place them side by side, I would say, so red, I'm not sure how well the red yarn is showing on the camera, but place them side by side, I would say the combination knitting method allows me to achieve not only faster knitting but also better tension. And the better tension comes from those fewer movements when I knit the purl stitches. Comparing the two methods together side by side, as you can see, there is a very little difference in terms of the way the stockinette stitch looks on the right side, and then if I turn the knitting over, the wrong side looks identical to me. The only difference between the two is the way our knit stitches are positioned. So another question in the comments was, how would you knit through the back loop? To knit through the back loop in the traditional continental knitting, we would pick the stitch from the back and insert the needle and then pull the yarn through it. That would give us a cross stitch. Some patterns ask for it, so you want to make sure that you can knit this. If you're using combination knitting method, how would you knit through the back loop? So obviously if we knit through here, which looks like a back loop in the continental knitting, but actually it's not the back loop, it's in fact the same as the front in the continental knitting, we will simply pick the left side of the stitch, which is positioned on the front side of the needle. So that would give us a cross stitch. If we need to make decreases in the combination method, we would approach them in a similar way to the way we do them in the continental knitting. So I'm just going to put my blue yarn down and I'm going to just go through the decreases in the continental knitting. So if we're making a left knit two leaning to the left, we would knit through the back loop, two together. So knit two together through the back loop, like so. So I'm just going to make a right leaning decreases now. So I'm just going to leave 3 stitches to the end on my needle, and then to make a right leaning decrease in continental knitting, we knit through the front loop. So pick up the 2 stitches through the front loop and form a knit stitch. In the combination knitting method, the decreases are formed in a very similar way. So if in the continental the left leaning decrease is knitted through the back loop, if we do this, we could do this, it's not going to result in the same effect. So what we need to do, so if we kind of see what happens when we do this, so the front stitch needs to be reversed out. So I'm just going to position the front stitch in the same way as is positioned in the continental knitting method, and then knit 2 stitches through, it would be the back loop for the front stitch and front for the back, and that gives me the same effect as on the left leaning decrease on the red yarn. I need one more. So for the left leaning decreases, the way we do in the continental knitting, we pick 2 stitches through the front loop. So if we do the same here, we end up with a cross stitch. That's not what we want. So if on the left leaning decrease we reposition the front stitch, on the right leaning decrease we need to reposition the second stitch. So we need to make sure that the second stitch is positioned the same way as the stitches are positioned in the continental knitting. So, and then we knit the 2 together just like we do in the continental knitting. And here is my right leaning decrease in the combination knitting. Now work 2 rows, the first row in decreases and the second row, and purling the stitches. It makes the decreases more prominent here. So you can see this is my left leaning decrease and this is my right leaning decrease. I'm going to do the same on my Continental knitting sample. So let's have a look at our decreases. So here is the left leaning decrease and here is the right leaning decrease. So as you can see, they look identical. So just to recap, if you are using a combination knitting method and you need to make decreases, right and left leaning decreases, in the left leaning decrease we need to reposition the first stitch, and in the right leaning decreases we need to reposition the second stitch when we knit two together.